Hi there, I'm Mrs. Lomax.
And I'm Mr. Lomax.
We'd like to talk to you this time about something called critical race theory.
Critical race theory, or CRT, is a body of ideas that came together in the 1970s because of scholars such as Derek Bell, Patricia Williams, Richard Delgado, Mari Matsuda, and
Hang on a second, you're getting a little ahead of yourself. If we're going to talk about critical race theory, then it means we're going to have to talk about race. That probably means we should set a few things straight and talk about terminology.
you're right, we're both white, and that means we should be clear about a few things.
First of all, while racism is real and is a systemic injustice that affects countless lives on a daily basis,
Our own lives have not been subject to those effects. That means, and we want to state this up front, that we're working here from reading that we have done
empathy that we feel,
and the belief we have that change is necessary.
racism is real.
We want to be allies
We want to educate ourselves.
and we want to advocate for universal education about these issues. Okay, now can I start talking about CRT again?
Not quite yet. We also need to set some ground rules. When we say race, we need to acknowledge that, first of all, race is not even a biological thing.
It really isn't. The human race is one blood, one species, and our shared genetic heritage goes deeper and longer than the tiny amount that people have been categorizing us into races.
Exactly.
But if race isn't a biological thing, what is it?
Race is a social construct. It's something societies have made up to categorize people and give some people privilege while denying it to others.
However, just because we say race is a social construct, that doesn't mean it doesn't affect people's lives.
After all, money is a social construct, reputation is a social construct,
Marriage,
honor,
obligation.
lunchtime.
Really?
No, I'm saying lunchtime is also a social construct.
All right, so true. And it affects us all. So now,
Oh, one more thing before we get to CRT. Let's talk about terminology.
right, this is a really good example of how race is a social construct. The very terms that people use to refer to people of different races are always changing.
And they vary around the world. Someone described as brown in California is probably Hispanic in ancestry.
Whereas in Toronto, brown usually identifies a person as being part of the South Asian diaspora.
In many parts of the world, black refers to people who trace their ancestry to Africa, though in Australia, that term has often referred to Indigenous peoples.
These days, people seem to agree that Indigenous Australians is the more respectful term.
In this lesson, we will have cause to use the term BIPOC, which is an acronym for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color.
It's a term that, according to the New York Times, probably has its origin on Twitter around 2013 and has generally been gaining acceptance since then.
Not everybody likes this term, however. Charmaine Nelson, for example, a professor of art history at McGill University, worries that this term erases distinctions between Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color.
Their histories of discrimination are different, after all, and you can't just lump everyone together.
Anyway, we're going to try to use this and other terms as respectfully as we can based on our reading.
Now, can we finally get back to critical race theory?
Don't you see? We've been doing it all along.
Wait, what?
Critical race theory is a way of looking at culture in order to understand how conceptions of race affect the products of culture.
Oh, that was sneaky. But how does that have to do with literature?
Well, as long as there has been racism, there's been literature that tried to justify that racism. A key point in Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist is the idea that racist policies, such as slavery or segregation, come first when those in power realize they profit from those policies.
Then racist ideas are made up to justify those policies. Europeans had started enslaving Africans long before the rich slavers started sponsoring so called scientists whose now debunked ideas were used to justify that slavery.
Kendi's idea is interesting in that people used to think of the other way around, that people in the past had these foolish ideas, and those foolish ideas led them to do bad things.
If you look at the history, you see it wasn't quite so. People wanted to do bad things and then supported those who came up with ideas to justify the bad things.
Critical race theorists then examine the cultural products of societies engaged in justifying racism.
As always, we can identify any theoretical framework by asking what questions it asks.
Here are the kinds of questions asked by critical race theory.
What is the significance of race in the story?
Does the story pass the race Bechdel test? That is, are there at least two BIPOC who talk to each other about something other than a white person?
Does the story present or acknowledge race? How so?
Does the story present or acknowledge racism? How so?
Do BIPOC have equal agency in the story? Do they have equal voices?
If the story deals with racism, does it do so in a knowledgeable way?
If the story presents racism, what audience is it produced for, and how does the audience targeted affect how the story is told? And like any other field, CRT has its own terminology.
You don't need to learn all of these right now, but they're really worth looking at and understanding.
BIPOC have, over decades, developed terms such as these to understand and educate about race and racism.
This terminology comes from people's daily lives and is well worth understanding.
I feel like we need a practical example here. What about that movie, The Help?
Actually, it was a novel first. There's a real problematic example. On the surface, it looks like a movie that might educate people about the evils of racism. It's set in the 1960s, the heyday of the civil rights movement.
And it clearly shows racism and racists in a bad light.
But it fits into what we call the white savior trope. The black people in the story need a white character to help them to stand up for them.
For a story about racism, it really puts the focus on how much the pretty white lady is really, really hurt when she discovers just how terrible racism is.
It's significant that the novel and the movie were written and produced by white people and that they were strongly criticized for softening the true horrors of that racist era.
It was also criticized for how much the novel and the movie allowed white people to benefit from telling black stories.
Viola Davis herself, the brilliant actress who starred as one of the maids in the movie, has talked about how she now regrets taking a role in a movie that privileged white voices over black ones.
This is just the tiniest introduction to critical race theory.
We apologize for how brief it is and encourage you to read more.
That Ibram X. Kendi book is a good place to start if you want to educate yourself on the history of racism. Thanks for listening.